All right. Um, okay, I think we're about 3 minutes past the hour, and I think a majority of people have probably joined, Simon. So I guess we should get things going.
Yeah,
Um, I'm sure we'll still have some laggards drifting in, but that's okay.
not a
So,
problem.
without further ado, I'm going to introduce Simon. My name is Graham McLeod from Inspired. We've set up the session. Simon has very graciously agreed to be our guest today, and we're very thrilled to have him, both because we're very big fans and admirers of his work and his influence and his impact. He's one of those rare people who doesn't just talk strategy, but does it, and not only does it, but does it well and effectively, and delivers value and improvements for the organizations that he works with. And he's also graciously shared his techniques with the industry and the community on an open basis. So I think that's to be applauded. A little bit about Simon's background. He's been in the IT industry. He's run big software development groups. He's built web and cloud products. He scaled those. He got involved with strategy for Canonical, helped them move from a small market share to a very, very dominant one as a cloud OS player. So he's been there, done that, got the t-shirt several times. And the other reason I'm really thrilled to have him with us today is he's also a brilliant presenter and very engaging. So we look forward to that. So Simon, thanks for being here
Thank
and
you.
welcome and let's have some fun.
All right. So first of all,
Oh,
thank you very much for the introduction. It's always terrifying when somebody says he's a really good presenter because that's my opportunity to now crash and burn all over the place. But thank you. Anyway, it was a very nice introduction. So at that point, I can see a number of people are familiar with mapping, and as with most audiences, there's a lot of people who aren't. So, what I will do is I will do an introduction into the topic, go a little bit deeper with the topic. We'll probably, spend about an hour doing that, and then afterwards, we'll have about half an hour. We can sort of go anywhere, deep dive into anything. And I've also prepared some other topics just in case. Can I just check you can all hear me clearly? Good.
perfect.
Perfect. Right, so let me share a screen uh, and let's get started.
There we
Uh,
go.
you can see that Wardley Mapping by Simon Wardley. Yes. I've also got a mirror board. So at the right time, I will take us into a mirror board because I've got a little example, a couple of things to play with, and we'll do that when we get to it. Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the origin of how I got into this topic of mapping, and then I'm going to talk about what a map is. After that, we'll look at the patterns, because one of the interesting things about maps is if you start mapping spaces out, you start to learn different types of patterns. Then, after that, we'll go into the concept of change itself. We'll use a set of those patterns to look at how uh, markets change and what you can anticipate. And after that, we'll get into gameplay. And finally, we'll sort of wrap it all up with X marks the spot. So this is basically a set of just general useful things to think about. Now, I also provided two other topics. There are many we could talk about. One of them is AI, only because there's a couple of reasons why I think AI is particularly dangerous. It's not the frontier AI type stuff and AGI. It's some other very specific things to do with the biases within the system. And then I'm going to talk about issues of sovereignty, if we want to. Okay. the basics are up until X marks the spot, and after that we get into these different issues. Now I'm getting a lot of pinging. I assume that's people joining the event. Are others experiencing that at all, or are you not hearing
Yes.
that? You are
Yeah.
hearing that as well. Right,
Just
that
people
may.
coming in.
Gotcha. Okay, well, we'll just have to cope with that.
Yeah.
Oh, so let me get started then. The origin. For me, mapping all started back in 2005. So I was working with this company. It was an online photo service. It had about 16 different lines of business. We were very profitable, but we had a big problem. And the big problem was this person, the CEO. Now, our CEO was clueless. They were just making stuff up as they went along. They hadn't got an idea about any idea about strategy. They didn't know what they were doing. But our revenue was growing and we were making profits. So I think people just sort of forgave him. Now, I know this is a fact because I was the CEO. I used to come up with this complete gibberish like our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source to become, all these sorts of wonderful vision statements. But these were basically pinched from other companies for which I literally just changed a few words. I hadn't got an idea of what I was doing. I was using agile techniques. I started adopting them in 2000 because somebody I knew, Kent Beck, had created something called extreme programming. I was using open source because I was recruiting from the open source space and we found it useful. There was no great sort of strategy behind any of this stuff. It was all sort of fairly random. Um, and I read every book I could find on strategy because I knew this was a problem or that I was a problem. And no matter what book I read, I wasn't getting anywhere. I was still just as confused as I began. And then I ended up in a bookshop in London, uh, and the it was in Charing Cross, and the bookseller asked me if I'd ever read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and I hadn't. So she persuaded me to buy two different versions of the book, mostly because they're translations, so they're all different. And the second is because she was great at selling books. So I bought these two books, and it was the reading of the second one that I noticed a particular pattern. So Sun Tzu talked about five factors that mattered in competition. Um, the first factor is purpose, a moral imperative to do something. The second factor that matters in competition is understanding your landscape, the environment you're actually competing in. The third factor is understanding climatic patterns, the weather, so how that landscape is changing. Then you understand doctrine, or doctrine is a collection of principles. So these are things to do. Um, and lastly, you understand gameplay leadership. So what you've got is have a purpose, understand your landscape, understand how the landscape is changing, understand basic principles of how you organize, how you structure yourself, and then look at the landscape, look at your structure, and then think about how do I change that space to my advantage? And this is where stratagems and gameplay and where you develop a strategy comes in. I was fascinated by this. And at the same time, I came across the Mad Major, John Boyd. Now, John Boyd, US Air Force pilot, came up with something called the OODA loop. So the first O of the OODA loop is to observe the environment. That's what landscape and climatic patterns are about. Then you need to orientate yourself around the space. That's what principles are about. And then finally, you need to decide where you're going to act, and then you act. And this is where the whole stratagems, gameplay come into their fore, because you want to change that environment to your advantage. Now, this was basically the strategy cycle, and I was fascinated by this because it sort of made sense to me. Remember, I was we were being successful, making money. I hadn't got a clue what we were supposed to be doing. And this gave me something to think about. And I got really fascinated by the idea of how do you observe the landscape that you're actually competing in. And that's what brought me onto maps. Now, I started to dive into, it's quite interesting having that ping pong in the background. I hope you don't mind. I'm not sure it's anything I can do about that. So I started getting into military history and I started to read all these different maps, and I started to realize that when we learn in military environments, we use maps as a way of learning. Now, the danger is we think about competition and we think, oh, it's about fighting others. That's not competition. Competition is the act of groups seeking something, resources, and there are multiple different strategies and techniques that we can use. And so, three of the basic ones are in competition are conflict, which is fighting others. There's cooperation, which is working with others, and there's collaboration. Sorry, cooperation is helping others, collaboration is working with others. So all three of those are aspects of competition. But in military history, it's often about, well, the lowest form of competition is conflict. You try to avoid it at all points, but when we do, we record these battles, and we often use maps to do this. So this is Themistocles. Themistocles, ancient politician, Greek general, had a problem. The Persians were invading. There are about 140,000 Persians invading. He had choices: defend around Thebes, defend around Athens. And what they decided to do was to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians along a narrow coastal path into, it was called Thermopylae, or otherwise known as the Hot Gates, where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. Now, there were about 4,000 Greeks in the Greek army, including 300 Spartans. And this is actually where we get the story of the 300 from. So the 300 versus the 140,000, because that narrow pass acts as a force multiplier. So I was fascinated by this because here I am talking about resources, I'm talking about people, I'm talking about a landscape, and I'm talking about the options that I had. And I went back and looked at my business, and I was using something called a SWOT diagram. Now, just in case you're not familiar, a SWOT diagram stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so I decided to create a SWOT diagram of this battle. So strengths: a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses: the E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities: get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian, we actually hate the Spartans. And the threats: the Persians get rid of us. And the oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. Now, my fascination was to put that side by side. And I simply asked the question, what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Some sort of magic framework like a SWOT diagram, or position and movement on a map. And it became obvious to me that I would use position and movement on a map. So why was I using SWOT diagrams? And what I realized back then is I didn't actually have a map of my business. So that got me going back into the office and demanding everybody send me all the maps they had. And they sent me loads of maps. They sent me customer journey maps, mind maps, business process maps, systems maps, all sorts of different maps. And I looked at these maps, and this is one. This is a systems map. Very simply, a number of different components connected by relationships. And this is for an online photo service. I took one component and I simply moved it. And I asked myself the question, how has that map changed? And the answer is, well, it hasn't. The relationships are still the same. So I went and had a look at geographical maps, and of course, That's obvious. If you move a component there, if I move, I don't know, South Africa, and I move it up to UK, obviously that map has changed. Why is it not changed here? And it took me ages to realize, but all of these maps had one thing in common. They're not maps, they're all graphs. So to understand the difference, these three images at the top are all identical and they're all graphs. Three places, Nottingham, London, Dover in the UK, connected by two roads, M1, M2. These three images at the bottom, they're all maps and they're all completely different. So the difference between a map and a graph is you look at this and think, well, they're completely different because they've got a compass. Yes, but that compass does something. What it does is it gives space meaning. So the three images at the top are all identical because space has no meaning. You can rotate it 90 degrees, 180, doesn't matter. But the three at the bottom are completely different because you can't do that. If you move something in that space, well, that has a meaningful effect. And in order for space to have meaning, you need three basic components. You need an anchor, such as magnetic north. You need position of pieces. This is north, south, east, and west of this. And you also need consistency of movement. So if I'm going north, I'm going north. If I'm going south, I'm going south. So I thought, great, I need to somehow create that for a map of my business. And then that will be a map. And then I can think about all those sorts of things that Themistocles did and try to use that as a way of communicating my strategy. Well, that was my idea, but I had no idea how to actually do this. So I started off by going, well, I did it for my business, but I'll give you the same thought process that I went through, but with a tea shop. So if you imagine you're running a tea shop, what's the anchor for a tea shop? Well, let's say we hope to have consumers buying cups of tea. So we'll have the public as an anchor, but we can have more than one. We have the business. We want the business to make money by selling cups of tea. So, okay, we can add that. And we could have others like regulators as well. So that's my anchor. At the top, what about position? Well, both of these things are connected through a common need, a cup of tea. And that cup of tea has needs. It needs tea, it needs a cup, it needs hot water. And hot water needs cold water and a kettle. And a kettle needs power. So what I've got is a chain of needs. And the further I go down this chain, the more invisible something becomes. So to those at the top, so to the member of a public, my cup of tea is very visible to them. But the power used to heat the kettle, well, to power the kettle, to heat the water, to make the cup of tea, well, the power is quite far removed. It's an essential part of this value chain, but it's very removed from the individual. Now, when we talk about value chain, that's usually within an organization. Supply chains are exactly the same thing, but it's over a wider set, so it's beyond the single organization itself. But that's still a graph because all I've got is anchor and position. I need to somehow capture this idea of movement. But how do you do that in a business? And this took approximately 6 months' work, 9,221 publications, a lot of text analysis and everything else, complete hellish time to eventually find a very simple way of describing movement. It turns out that all of these components are forms of capital and they evolve through four common stages. Now, technically, we should call them stage one, stage two, stage three, stage four. That's not very meaningful. When we talk about physical activities, we use labels of genesis, custom, product, commodity. When we're talking about practices, novel, emerging, good, and best. When we talk about ethical values, we'll start with concept, emerging, converging, accepted. They're all exactly the same. It's just different labels for the same characteristics. So if I take activities, which I often do. You start off with the genesis, custom built product, commodity, and I simply go through my chain asking, how evolved is this component? Is it Genesis? The first time anybody's ever created, I don't know, a cup of tea? Or is it custom built? I can't go and buy a cup of tea somewhere else. We think of it as a fairly unique differential for us. Or is it more of a product sort of space? There are lots of different places I can go to get a cup of tea. It's not really a differential. It's about how well they make the cup of tea, or is it just a sort of almost like a bog standard commodity? Nobody thinks about it. And what I can do is simply go through each component and put it roughly where I think it is. And that's a map. Now, the point about the maps is that in business, we tend to run our business with stories. And the problem with stories is that when you challenge somebody's story, you're challenging the person. And that's because we tell everybody that great leaders are great storytellers. So when I say to you, I think your story is wrong, they get very defensive and blah. If you get the story of your tea shop onto a map, then I can look at the map and challenge the map without challenging the person. So I can say things like, I think the map is wrong. I think, why have we got kettle and custom built? Surely we should have maybe commodity kettles. We should be standardizing that space. I might be able to look at the map and saying, do you know, I think we're missing something. I think we need staff on that map as well. So that's the so what. Why does it matter? Because you can challenge the assumptions that people have in a fairly safe environment. Now, to give you an example of this, I took groups of, in the UK, Brexiteers and Remainers. This was just after the referendum, in order to map out a concept of culture. Now, these particular groups in story form, they could not discuss anything. I sit them in the room. I ask the Remainers if they want a cup of tea. They would go yes. If I asked the Brexiteers, because the Remainers had said yes, they would go no. And if they then said, yeah, who wants a biscuit? The Brexiteers would go yes, and the Remainers would insist on cake. I mean, basically, these people were anything the other group said, they almost all opposed. I mean, it was very hostile. But I managed to get them to map out the concept of culture through the medium of map. And so we often use these in conflict resolution as well, because we can get people discuss quite complex concepts without talking to each other in story form. Okay, so I'll give you an example, make it a little bit more real. This is an insurance company. This was back in, oh gosh, 2011-ish, I guess. They needed compute in their data centers. They would order a server would come in to goods in, they'd modify, mount, and rack it. And they had a big bottleneck, which was about modification and mounting of servers. And this was impacting their business, so they came up with a plan. They spent 6 months looking at different vendors. They had this idea of using robotics to do all of this stuff, automating this entire process. So they came up with this plan. It was many, many, many millions of expenditure to build this particular system. But they'd gone all the way to doing their business case, return on investment calculations, were actually sub 1 year. It's pretty remarkable. And they're ready to go. And so somebody asked me to have a look at this. Now, the problem is that business case represents their story. So very difficult to go in and say, why are we spending money on robotics? They just fire the business case at you, etc. So I said, well, can we map this? And we spent about 15 minutes arguing over whether to map it or not. And they eventually agreed, and we took 15 minutes to map. So this was the map that was created. So user needs compute. Oh, it's 2010. Sorry. User needs compute, order server, goods in. I mean, I'd look at it, and even in 2010, I'd be asking, I can understand why they think order and server is a commodity, but why is compute product not commodity? We had EC2 back in 2006. Fair enough. They had their own data center. And then they had rack mount modify. Now, I was able to look at the map and simply ask questions. I asked them, why have we got rack in custom built? And it turns out they had custom built racks. So I said, well, what are the modifications you're making to servers? Well, the servers they bought didn't fit their racks. So they had to take cases off, drill new holes, add new plates in order to get them to fit their racks. Ah, and that's why you need robotics, yes. And so in the middle of that room, somebody just went, why aren't we using standard racks? Because if they use standard racks, we don't need to modify servers and we don't need any of this robotic stuff at all. Now, the reason why they're not using standard racks is at some point in time in the past, there was no such thing as a standard. And so they'd obviously been quite advanced in what they were doing and introduced this concept of racks, and they had their own versions of racks, which they had built. And that became the story, the narrative, the part of that particular organization. And they never challenged it. And this is unbelievably common. The number of times I go into organizations and see them custom building stuff, which is actually a commodity. Now, they weren't doing anything, wrong. What they were doing is they were constantly focusing on process flow. So they're trying to improve the process flow in the organization, which would drive you down to this sort of path of thinking I need robotics. What they were missing was the fact that things evolved. So racks were no longer needed to be custom built, hadn't been for a long time. They were very much commodity. And of course, it was about half an hour later, 15 minutes after arguing about mapping, 15 minutes of actually doing the map, half an hour of discussion. And by that point, we got to a realization that compute was actually no longer a product, it was more of a utility. And so they shouldn't be investing many millions in robotics. They should be moving to a cloud provider, which is where they went. But there was no chance of me actually overturning the story without having this sort of conflict. I had to get them into this environment so they could understand what they were doing and then challenge it themselves. All right, so you learn a basic pattern here that everything evolves. And I mention that because if there's supply and demand competition, all of these components are in flux. There is no time on a map. You put a date on a map like 2010, but all maps evolve and change over time. But that leads me to my next topic, which is patterns. So the way I learn patterns fairly simply is through what I call pre-mortem and post-mortem challenge. So pre-mortem challenge is where we basically sit down, look at what we're going to do, and we map it, and we challenge what we're doing. Why are we custom building racks? Why are we custom building kettles? Then once we've agreed how to do something, we go and build it. And then when we go and build it, once it's live and everything else, we come back and look at the maps, and we do basically, well, it's more post-mortem learning. We sit down and we look at the map and go, well, what did we get wrong with the map? What's actually changed? What did we discover? And it's through that process we find patterns. Now, there are three basic forms of patterns that you discover. There's climatic patterns, doctrine, and leadership patterns. The climatic patterns are the rules of the game. These are things like everything evolves. There's 30 of those. Then there's principles, that's a collection of which are called doctrine. There's about 40 of those. And then there's the stratagems. There's about 100 different forms of those, ways of manipulating the market to your favor. And most people are oblivious to all of this stuff, which is unsurprising because they can't see the environment. All right, so I'm going to talk about principles. I've already sneaked a few in. The first principle that you learn is know your users, which is what we do when we're defining the anchors of a map. We're thinking about who our users are and also what their needs are. So they have a need for a cup of tea. The business has a need to make profit from a cup of tea. Know the details is another principle I've sneaked in there. So that's the point of understanding, the value chain. And you don't have to stop within your organization. It's often useful to go to the wider supply chain, both above your organization and underneath your organization. Another principle is understand what is being considered. There's a world of difference between a custom-built kettle and a commodity kettle. So it's not enough to simply understand the chain. You have to understand how evolved those components are. Right, another principle. I'm going to use an example to explain this one. This is comes from HS2, High Speed Rail, a big heavy engineering project in the UK. This is James Finley. He's the former CIO for HS2. And James had a problem. That problem was how to build HS2 in a virtual world. So this is the systems diagram uh, that he had, or a simple overview of the systems diagram. And the reason why you build, and this is for building HS2 in a virtual world, and the reason why you do this is it's cheaper to dig up a virtual world and go, whoops, we got that wrong, than the English countryside. So the first thing you want to do is build the entire railway in a virtual world, and this is how they were going to do it. Now, this is also an architectural form of architectural diagram. The problem with architectural diagrams is mostly they're diagrams of belief, i.e., they're our perception of what we think the architecture is at a particular moment in time. They're not often actually generated directly from the systems themselves. There are ways of generating these diagrams directly from the systems themselves, and there are very good reasons to do so. But unfortunately, it's for whatever reason, it doesn't tend to be a habit of doing it. Mostly it's because the tool sets, actually, I think, are the problem. And there's an approach known as moldable development, which particularly focuses on this issue. So most of the time, when we make decisions in business, or we're making decisions based upon diagrams which are actually not necessarily representative. You know this if you've ever seen an architectural diagram and gone, oh, I think we're missing some components, because they're statements of belief, which is why most of the stuff we do in business is gut feel rather than, hypothesis and model driven. Okay, but nonetheless, this is their architectural-ish diagram, their statement of belief of what they think they need. And the way we used to manage this in government was pretty simple. We'd group together things which were familiar, like a bounded context, and we'd put them into lots. And these are lots that we'd put out to tender as contract. So we'd have like lot one engineering, we'd put all the engineering-y stuff, lot two user experience, lot three back office, lot four infrastructure. And then we'd outsource this to various of our favorite providers. They would go and build it, would have massive cost overruns, lots of change control problems. The price would always exceed whatever was bid, and it was usually, well, most often, a fairly torturous process. So James didn't want this to be the case, and so we tried something different. And this was about 2012-ish, sort of. Um, he spent Sunday afternoon and he simply mapped it out. And he sent that map to me, got it right this time, and said, how do you manage this? Okay, how do I manage an environment like this? This is his map. Now, for me, this is pretty straightforward and simple, because I'd learnt, having gone all agile, all extreme programming beforehand, in about 2000. I'd learnt by 2005, 2004, I'd say, that it doesn't work everywhere. What I'd learnt back in 2006, a year after I had maps, is that there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all methodology for project management or purchasing or finance, because as things evolve across their map, the characteristics change. So they start off in this uncharted space where they're chaotic, uncertain, different. It's like computing started off there in 1943 with the Z3, and eventually over time it evolves to much more commodity, much more industrialized, which is very standardized and specific. So you've got something like AWS EC2. So the characteristics change. So if you think about building something, um, well, how do you build something with almost polar opposite characteristics? Well, you don't. What you do is use agile extreme programming on the left-hand side, because in the uncharted space, that's where change is normal. So what you want to do is reduce the cost of change, and that's what extreme programming is very good at. But on the right-hand side, you want to be reducing deviation. So you'll add in techniques like Six Sigma. You'll look at outsourcing to a utility provider if possible. I mean, that's where that's strong. And in the middle, you probably want to be using lean off-the-shelf products, focused on learning and reducing waste. And this is where things like Scrum and MVP and all that sort of techniques come into play. So what you learn is you need to use multiple different techniques at the same time for any system. So you simply apply that to a map. So you build in-house with agile techniques. You may use off-the-shelf products, use lean. You could even, there might be some of this stuff. You might have a particular consultancy group who specializes in that sort of border area between custom and product. That's fine. You might use them. But on the right-hand side, you're going to be outsourcing to more utility suppliers. You're going to be concentrating on techniques like Six Sigma. So what you learn is there's no such thing as one size fits all. Use appropriate methods, use multiple. And that's exactly what James did. This got in front of the Public Accounts Committee because it ended up being delivered way ahead of schedule, way under budget, which was like fantastic for a government contract. And it's simply by breaking it down and using appropriate methods. And of course, they could start to play games with this because, as I said, everything evolves over time. And because it evolves, it's going to head towards more of a commodity. You can even influence this by doing things like open source, which tends to drive things in that direction. So you can start to, once you get good at this, start to look at manipulating this stuff. So you wait until you've got something custom built. You think you can encourage it into a range of products by doing certain actions. You might do that, and then you buy up the product. These are the sorts of games you get into. All right, I'm going to go back to our Lot 1 engineering, our original contract structure, and focus on Lot 1 engineering. So normally we'd have outsourced this to another provider and we'd have cost overruns and failures, but why? So I'm now going to take that and apply it to the map. So I'm just going to highlight the same components on the map, and that's what Lot 1 engineering looks like. Now I can look at this contract, if I attempt to write a contract for this, and I know it's going to fail before I've signed the paperwork. And the reason being is the stuff on the right can be specified, but the stuff on the left can't be. So if I try and stick this in a contract, I mean, I'm going to end up with a fight with the vendor. The vendor is always going to point to the components which they delivered on time, and they're going to say that all the problems were due to me because I didn't know what I really wanted. I couldn't specify it. Well, you can't specify it because I'm learning in that space still. The problem is, in fact, the contract. Unfortunately, what happens often in negotiations or discussions with the vendor is somebody from your own side tends to say, well, next time you need to specify it better. Well, you can't. It's just a trap. What you need to do is break those contracts and make sure that things that we're putting in highly defined contracts to outside parties are actually more commodity utility. We're going to have to find different ways and different contract structures for dealing with those things which are constantly changing. Anyway, it's the bit on the left which was causing the cost overruns. I mean, I regularly get asked to come in and have a look at a contract, and what I would do is simply map it out. Once you've mapped it out, then or mapped out the space from the specification, you can then look at how they've broken it down into often lots, and you can literally point out this lot's going to fail, this one's going to fail, that one's going to be okay, and so you can use the maps as a way of telling you which contracts are going to fail. Give you an example, government, one project alone, we saved 425 million by simply mapping it out. I mean, these sound like ridiculous figures, and I don't for a moment think that's because I know we've got all the dog stuff going on in the US. And yes, there is and can be waste in government, but the levels of inefficiency I've seen in government are nothing compared to what I've seen in the private sector. Um, to give you an idea, the in terms of duplication of systems, the worst I've ever seen in government is 118 systems doing the same thing, which was 118 different ways of registering prisoners into correctional facilities. Now, you might think, gosh, how could you have 118 ways of doing the same thing? Isn't that wasteful? Well, in the private sector, I stopped counting with a particular bank when we got to 1,000 risk management systems. So I don't know how many risk management systems they had, but we stopped counting at 1,000. Now, this particular organization was, which, thought its duplication was in the like five, six, seven, or eight, the usual wishful thinking. I have pharma companies who've got 100, what was it, 100, sorry, 350, sorry, I should say, teams building enterprise content management systems, which is just like, oh, 5 global efforts as well to build a global enterprise content management system. The amount of waste I see in the private sector is massive compared to what I see in government. The main difference is that government has things like national audits offices, major project authorities. So they have a process of challenge, where the private sector tends to have a magic carpet where we lift it up and sweep it under and pretend it never happened. Anyway, this particular bank was always flabbergasted and always wondering how they could compete against others. The fact is, I worked with other banks, so I knew they were just as wasteful. There's just the same sort of level of duplication mess. But anyway, so this one particular project, we saved about, well, 425 million, about 1.5 billion in its lifetime is estimated. So I've got an example, which I was thinking about throwing into a mirror board, but actually I think I'll just do it verbally. This is to do with a self-driving car. So what I've done is I've taken a self-driving car and I've taken the systems diagram, and I call this my Elvish self-driving car because I've translated it all into Elvish. And so here's my systems diagram for a self-driving car. And the reason why I've translated it into Elvish is that for many people in business, IT is a bit Elvish, and for many people in IT, the business and finance is a bit Elvish. So it seems fair to translate it all into Elvish. Now, if I asked you a question like, there's 3 different components, we'll pick B, what would you do? How would you manage B? Would you outsource it? Would you build off-the-shelf products? Would you sort of, use off-the-shelf? Would you build it in-house? Well, I have no idea. The thing is, we use architectural diagrams of these forms to make these sorts of judgment calls about how to treat something. But the diagram itself gives me nothing. Now, if I give you exactly the same diagram in a mapping format, here it is, and I ask the same question of B again, would you, build in-house? Would you off-the-shelf product? Would you outsource it? Now, because you've learned that basic pattern, you're more likely to be let's build in-house, let's use off-the-shelf products. Maybe a bit too early for that. I mean, if I said I'm going to outsource B to a utility provider, you'd probably start challenging me, even though we don't actually know what that is because it's all in Elvish. And this is the power of having this sort of mapping environment, and why you extend it beyond simple graphs. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about another set of patterns, which are the climactic patterns, otherwise known as rules. And this is useful for change and for anticipation. So this is roughly where compute was in 2005. User needs an application built on best coding practice, on a runtime operating system, best architectural practice on compute as a product. And the first pattern you learn is everything evolves. If there's supply and demand competition, everything is going to start off in Genesis, end up in commodity. And as it becomes more commodity-like, it's going to become more efficient. That doesn't mean we're going to spend less money on it because of Jevons paradox, the coal question, which basically is they made steam engines more efficient. So people thought we're going to use less coal, and they ended up using more coal because they made steam engines more efficient, i.e., they found more uses for steam engines now. So as compute becomes a utility, you expect all sorts of new things to be created. But the first pattern you learn is yes, everything evolves. The second pattern you learn is that past success breeds inertia. So if you look at somebody like Nokia versus Blockbuster, um, the first with a website was Blockbuster. The first with video ordering online was Blockbuster. And the first with video streaming experiments was Blockbuster. And the first that went bankrupt was Blockbuster. So the problem with Blockbuster and Netflix was a DVD mail order company, is that it wasn't that Blockbuster lacked innovation, they out innovated everybody. Their problem was they had inertia created by their pre-existing business model, which was fundamentally based on late fees, which required a physical store. So, there's Blockbuster, all the innovation, all the money, huge inertia to change, and Netflix comes in. DVD mail order company doesn't have any stores, so it doesn't have any inertia to the concept of video streaming. In fact, it fitted in very nicely with its pre-existing business model. So inertia, there's about 16 different forms of inertia, from things like physical capital to political capital. These can be very dangerous, very, very problematic for companies. They convince you that whatever is not changing. So in the world of compute, there's a whole bunch of people who had lots of compute, lots of practices around compute as physical products, lots of things like data centers who had inertia to this change towards cloud. The next pattern you learn is coevolution. So it's about 2007. You started to see this appear. And what that means is as the underlying component changes, the practices also change. So the reason is because of characteristics. So compute used to have a characteristic of high MTTR, high mean time to recovery. Now, as it evolved to a utility, it changed to low mean time to recovery. So what that means is high mean time to recovery is it used to take us weeks or if not, months to get new machines. So we used to do things like capacity planning, disaster recovery, all those sorts of good stuff. As it became more of a utility with a low MTTR, so you could get machines in seconds, we now distribute systems designed for failure, chaos engines. We do things like continuous deployment because we can. We're not waiting months for the machine to turn. Okay, so you get co-evolution of practice. You also get efficiency enables innovation, so new higher order systems appear, things like Netflix, and those new higher order systems create new sources of value or worth. So what you get is that sort of efficiency, speed, new value, and that gives you no choice over evolution. Because if you're competing with others and they adapt and they gain those benefits of efficiency, speed, and new value, that puts pressure on you to adapt. And as more people adapt, that pressure mounts. And this is called the Red Queen effect, which is why, we have no choice. Eventually, we get rid of all the punch card systems. I mean, there's still one or two in place, but very, very few. So what? Why does this matter? Okay. So this is useful for looking at where to invest. So if I look at, here I am in with a map of compute, and I'm looking at this. Where do I invest on this line? Well, it's difficult to know. Maybe I should invest in the operating system. Now, if I add those patterns that you saw, and we see computes going to cloud, I've got inertia, there'll be a new emerging practice and new things being created, it becomes much easier to say, well, look, these are the areas that we should invest in. And that's exactly what I did with Canonical. Canonical was an operating system, or is an operating system. We were up against Microsoft and Red Hat. They had all the billions, all the engineers, they had everything. We were very small. We were 3% of the operating system market. And we spent 500,000. It took us 18 months and we took 70% of all cloud computing. And because we knew where to attack. It's a bit like playing a game of chess where you get to see the board and the other person doesn't. All they get to do is randomly shout out pieces. They don't even know what those pieces do, and they don't even know there's a board. It's a bit of a one-sided contest. So even though we were tiny up against these giants, because we knew where to attack, it was fairly easy, straightforward for us to take the majority of the cloud market. It also teaches you where not to invest. So don't get involved, in those things stuck behind inertia barriers. All right, so roll forward a little bit more, 2010. The emerging practices eventually got a name. Andy and Patrick, they're friends of mine, called it DevOps. Then best architectural practice got a new name. It got the new name of Legacy. So it was best architectural practice for computers as a product, but we can now call it Legacy because we're in a world of computers as a utility. Roughly 2014, runtime started to shift, becoming more of a utility itself with things like AWS Lambda. Same pattern, efficiency, new practice. Eventually, we called it FinOps. New needs being created, new things. So if you were looking 2016, where would you invest? In more serverless, more FinOps, more the things being created on top. Where would you avoid all the stuff stuck behind inertia barriers? Now, of course, in that you see, oh, look, DevOps and cloud. Yeah, I mean, by 2016, they're already on the path to becoming the new legacy. I mean, there's often huge time delays between organizations. So even 2021, you hear organizations going 2022, less so these days, but you hear people saying we're going to adopt DevOps and go cloud. And we were already talking 2016 about how we have to go serverless and FinOps and start dumping this stuff. But anyway, the point is that you learn that strategy is iterative. What you do in 2008 is not the same as what you do in 2016. There's a wonderful book all about an insurance company who heavily adopted serverless. You can read about that and the flywheel effect. Lots of maps in that book as well. So now that brings us to stratagems, which is the bit where we talk about gameplay. So stratagems are contextually specific patterns. So climatic patterns are rules of the game. It doesn't matter what you do, things are going to evolve. You're going to have inertia, whether you like it or not. You're going to see co-evolution of practice. Then you have principles like focus on user needs, understand the supply chain, understand how evolved components are. Those are things you get choice over. They're universally useful, so good idea to do them, but you don't have to. You could decide, I'm not going to focus on user needs. I'm not going to understand my supply chain. Fair enough. Or here there's I don't know if you can hear a bit of noise in the background. I live in a swamp, as I said, and every now and then we hear a bit of soaring. Um, and then there's gameplay, and gameplay are context specific. So what that means is that they work in specific context, obviously. So something like open source is very good for driving things from early stages to more of a commodity. It accelerates supply and demand competition, but it makes little difference if you apply it in the genesis of something. There's very little difference with proprietary. I mean, you get lots of people talk about this stuff, but the data doesn't support it. So you find these patterns work in certain contexts, and so that's also why it's important to learn to map the space before you try and apply them. Because if you apply them in a wrong context, you'd actually cause yourself harm. And there's about 100 of these, and I'm not going to go through them all, so I'll just mention a couple. Actually, I'll mention one. One of my favorite is a model called ILC, Innovate, Leverage, Commoditize. And it's very simple. This particular pattern, you take a product and you turn it into a utility service, which you provide to others as a component service. So we'll take something like compute, you turn it into compute as a utility, and we'll give it a name, we'll call it EC2. What happens is everybody else builds on top. because it's easier to build. This is componentization effects. Now, what they build can be all sorts of things. They might build, I don't know, kid internet, which goes nowhere. They might build a big data system, which starts to grow. Now, you're billing them because you have to bill them. You're providing a service. And that billing data tells you what's growing in that market. So you can use it to spot patterns like, oh, big data's growing, and come up with a new component service, which we'll call Elastic Map Reduce. Everybody cheers because they can build new things more quickly, except for the people who've lost their business model, who go, oh, they've eaten my business model. Now, the model is very simple. You get everybody else to innovate for you. You don't do the innovation yourself. You let everybody else do that. You mine the metadata to spot the patterns. And what you focus on is commoditizing this stuff to component services. The best way I know of doing this is to force your organization to focus on the commoditization part. And the best way I know of doing that is to introduce something called the press release process. So what you do is you force everybody in that space, because by telling people you can't build stuff unless you've written the press release, and we're going to judge you against the press release, well, you can't build a press release for something in the uncharted space because we're still learning. We don't know what it's going to be. The only place you can effectively build a press release for is a pre-existing late-stage product, which you're going to turn into more of a utility. Now, the beauty of this model is you concentrate on moving up the stack on the right-hand side. And your rate of innovation is now proportional to the size of the ecosystem built on top of you, because they're all doing the innovation for you. Your customer focus is now proportional to the size of ecosystem built on top of you, because you're mining metadata. And of course, your efficiency is just economies of scale. You can read about this model. I made this model back in 2005 in a book called Reaching Cloud Velocity. It's AWS's second ever book, as in published not by AWS. So it's a book written in AWS by AWS. And you'll find 17 pages of my mapping in there, including this particular model, because it's a great way of destroying industry after industry. It's very simple. You don't look at anybody's data. You just use the metadata, the billing data. You concentrate on commoditization. And you just climb up the stack by compute, machine learning engines, platforms, discrete services. Very easy. Now, it's not just companies, because you probably go, oh, doesn't that what AWS does? Governments can do this as well. China's fantastically skilled at playing these sorts of games, heavily on the industrialization, to the point that it uses a mixed economic model to do this stuff. And you can see this just by looking at import-export ratios between China and the US. Going back to 1993, 2013, I'm sure by 2033, most of this. So the blue color is the US, it's import-export balance between the two, and you can see mostly China was on footwear luggage. It's gone up the value chain, and if you map out those industries, this game becomes even more clear that it's constantly climbing this chain. X marks the spot. Number one, know your users. I mean, it sounds a ridiculous thing to say, but whenever you're doing anything, building something, start by understanding who your users are and what their needs are. It is surprising how few companies actually do this. Once you've done that, that's not enough. You've got to know the details. You've got to understand the components involved. You have to be mindful of as well that ideally you want to, if it's a pre-existing system, I mean, I deal a lot with legacy systems, particularly legacy systems which, well, my favorite ones are ones which are basically Legacy environments, which are black boxes where the language is considered dead, as in nobody knows how to write the language because the language, all the original programmers have gone, and often the language was written by people who've also gone as well, and there's no documentation. So you've got a multi-billion-dollar company, and at the heart of it, it's this critical black box which everybody's terrified of, and nobody wants to touch or anything along those lines. And these are my favorite environments because there's ways of building tools to get into that and to transform those environments. But really important in general, just know the details as much as you can. Make that automated. Understand what is being considered. Um, if you look at a system, uh, it's not enough to know that there's a kettle. You've got to know, well, what sort of kettle am I talking about? Custom built or more of a commodity? Uh, Whenever you look at supply chains, it's not just that it exists, but how evolved that matters. You've got to think about the fact that everything evolves. So even once you have a map that's completely dynamic, it'll change constantly all the time through individual actors' actions. As movement and competition occurs, every component in your map will evolve. As it evolves, you're going to have inertia because of pre-existing capital. Particularly if you've got a successful business model in space. So, like if you look at telcos, it was very clear back around about 2017, 2018, 2019, we were heading into non-terrestrial networks. You still get all these telcos focused on things like 5G. I mean, a critical thing to have invested in was launch capability. That didn't happen. I mean, launch at low Earth orbit satellites. So you get to 2025, that's now dominated by the likes of Starlink and SpaceX. I mean, if you're a telco in that space, you've got well, you can only really play the sovereign game now. Point to examples of what's going on in Ukraine in the hope that your government gives you breathing space so you can play catch up. But remember, past success breeds inertia, very dangerous. Understand that efficiency enables innovation. So often people will talk about we've got to be innovative. One of the fastest ways of making yourself innovative is to move as much stuff which should be commodity into being a commodity. That'll open the ability for you to do novel and new stuff. Remember that higher order systems create new sources of worth. And so if you map out your space, starting with thinking about users, understanding the components and how evolved, if you then apply basic patterns of change to it, you can use this to work out where to invest and also where not to invest. You can also use this for organizational models as well. There's a lovely paper on this called Boiling Frogs by GCHQ, which is our intelligence services, which goes through some interesting organizational structures, which are based upon the concepts of mapping. Once you get good at this stuff, then you can start doing things like IRC and gameplay, manipulating the space with things like open source. As I said, there's about 100 different ways. I wouldn't start there though. Most people have no understanding. Most people want to jump into action, but it's a really good idea to look at your space before you do any of those sorts of things. All right. So I've taken you through the origin, how I got into maps, which is basically I was running a company. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I ended up in a bookshop talking to a bookseller. They sent me off on this journey, which was all caused by The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and mostly around those particular five factors that mattered. Have a purpose and moral imperative, understand your landscape, understand the climatic patterns, understand doctrine, principles of organization, and then you're into gameplay. This sent me off on a journey into mapping. Eventually, I was able to create a map of my competitive environment. I mean, those maps are not graphs. So most things I have in business called maps are not maps. In order to be a map, that space has to have meaning because you're looking at a landscape. Once I
Okay.
started mapping 20 years ago, I got into learning patterns. So these were like climatic patterns. And that's useful for anticipation and change. Once you start getting good at that, you can start looking at how to manipulate the space to your favor. And then I just wrapped it all up at the end. Now I've got two other topics, one on AI and a particular threat with it, and one is on sovereignty. But I think we
Mhm.
can open it up for questions. Did you, sorry, all of a sudden I've got very high pollen count. I can see sensors going off coming in. That must have been because I've suddenly got a bit of a blocked nose all of a sudden. So I hope that doesn't come across. Can you hear me okay? Was that all
Yeah,
clear?
we can hear you fine, Simon. Thank you very much.
Good. Right.
Okay,
Question.
I think,
Shoot.
yeah, let's open it up for questions. I think Simon can talk about many other topics as well, as he has alluded to. What I will ask is if you're interested in hearing more about the AI topic and or another topic which Simon is
Sovereignty.
working on about sovereignty,
Or rewilding software engineering. Or
but even the
that's a
third
different day.
one, which is rewilding software engineering, where he's working with company called Fink, whom we also collaborate with. Those are all
Or or there
fascinating
is organizational
topics.
models, which is explorers, villagers, town
Yeah.
planners. That's about 20 years
Yes.
old.
Yes.
Then we have
These are all
investment
great.
policies and profile. There's
Okay.
loads. We could
Yes,
do it
there
all
are
day long.
loads, and I certainly hope we'll have Simon back again in future. And I think there's still a huge amount we can learn from him. But let's open up the floor for questions, please. Please just raise a hand, and we'll ask you to
We've got yes, keep going. Yes, please, AI and beyond the hype. Right. Okay. Okay. Well,
Okay,
all
let's
right.
move to
Hang
Ian.
on. Duncan Ross asks, are there situations where the mapping approach hasn't worked? Where would you say the boundaries are? That is such a fantastic question.
Yep.
All right. So the mapping itself is limited by the fact that there has to be competition. Now, competition has three basic forms. There's conflict, as in fighting others, cooperation, helping others, collaboration, working with others. So you've got to have multiple people seeking something. So it's got to be a competitive environment. And the reason for this is the evolution. Those labels come from an evolution curve, which is based upon demand and supply competition. So if you're talking about non-competitive environments, so there isn't collaboration, cooperation, or conflict, no, you haven't got groups of people seeking something, then I don't know how to do that. Okay, so that is a limitation and constraint. There has to be competition. And normally, when we talk about competition, you normally have multiple actors. You may conflict with some, you collaborate with others to conflict with those, you cooperate over here, you may cooperate to collaborate. So you use combinations all at the same time. But as long as that stuff is going on, you can map that space and you can map it across economic, technological, political, and social landscapes as well. Now, when we compete, there are five basic landscapes we compete in: territorial, economic, technological, political, social. Four of those we don't look at. We're very good at situational awareness and territorial landscapes. And so when we talk about things like sovereignty, we talk about borders and all that sort of stuff where we collaborate with others. The same is true for the other four, except for we don't tend to look. Um, doesn't mean everybody's the same. I mean, I mentioned China. China's fantastic in the technological and economic landscapes. They're really good at understanding those landscapes and targeting them. We tend to be much more, we leave it to the market, which is like, that's an interesting, it gives more blind faith that the market will magically solve the problems. And then we have things like, I don't know, COVID or Ukraine or Brexit, and we have all sorts of problems, and we discover we don't understand our supply chains beyond one up, one down, and we get into all sorts of trouble. So, yes, there is a constraint, there's got to be competition. Right, keep on going, keep on going. Let's do something
Okay.
outside of technology and products. Okay, I can take you through cultural maps and other bits and pieces. But how long have I got? Oh, in the 90 minutes, there isn't time. But I'll give you a link. Uh, Mapping and sovereignty. All right. Okay. Now that let me Do you mind if I continue? Unless there's a question you want to shoot.
Ian was waiting to pose a question. I think he may have had
Oh,
to hop
I can still ask it. I
somewhere.
was going to put it in the chat.
Okay.
But
Yep,
it's very basic,
go
very
for it.
simple question. So hopefully a very quick answer. Um, on a map,
Yep.
does the position of the anchors have meaning similarly to the position of their needs, or is that
Yes.
slightly separate?
Yes. No, no, no. So it does. So all of everything you see on a map is a component. So the anchors themselves are actually components,
Okay.
and it's just that we use different labels at the bottom. So there's a couple of things, specific things you should know with a map. The y-axis is a dotted line. Okay, because it doesn't actually exist. There is no y-axis. It was only ever put on there as scaffolding for people because I used to draw the value chains, and the only things you really think about is how evolved those components are. And so your visibility is actually through the chain. So there's multiple axes because you can go through multiple different pathways. But people needed something, so we say we're drawing a line and we say visibility at the top, but it's not really anything there at all. The axis is within the chain. In terms of no, did that answer the question?
I, I think it did. Yes, I'll have to reflect, but yeah, I think it did. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Just
Can
repeat the
we?
question to me again.
Oh,
Sorry.
the question was about where you define your users. So,
Oh, yes.
for the cup of
Yeah.
tea, it was the
Sorry.
public and the business.
Yeah.
How do you define that the public are commodity rather than
Yes.
the business? Is it because the business has slightly more specialized needs than the
Yeah.
public, and the public just want tea, but the business want to make money from tea, which is a bit
Yeah.
more.
So my apologies for that. So yes, the labels at the bottom should be stage one, two, three, four. But I just put we have different labels
Mhm.
depending on if we're talking about physical activities, practice, data, knowledge, whatever, and they're all in something called the cheat sheet. So you'll often see me going, concept emerging, converging, accepted, or you see me going, Genesis, custom product, commodity. It's all the same. And when you think about the anchors at the top, they are just components because they're often components. This difference between a value chain and supply chain, they're often components of a wider supply chain. So the value chains in your organization, you often have something at the top which is serving somebody else's need. So they are just a component there. So yes, you think about them component and you think in the same characteristics, and you can see those characteristics in the cheat sheet. Does that help?
It does. Thank you.
Pleasure. Right. Any other, or can
Okay.
I?
Can we move to Dante?
Hi,
Are you quick
thank you.
because we may not get through there?
I'll try to be quickly and brief. First of all, thank you for a great presentation. Something struck me when you mentioned those 1,500 risk systems you had to face, which was which is something I had to face in different banks as well. And it appears to me that it's not necessarily, there's something that's not necessarily addressed by the maps. And I'm wondering if you have techniques for that, which is vocabulary. So,
Okay, so one of
what,
the things that we often find with a map, because for example, I did like mapping out Department of Work and pensions, which has huge numbers of different benefit systems. Or I'd say we ended up with about 60, 70 maps there, and other places where we've ended up with, 100 maps, is you'll often in the map find that people love to use weird terms. They call this the XZZ whatever system or blah blah blah. And when you're mapping, you start to try and unpick what that is. And because the maps tell you what it's connected to, you often discover that we call identically the same things in different names, in different places. And that's quite common. So in the risk management, it was not like they all called them risk management. They had all these wonderful different names, but they are all fundamentally doing exactly the same thing. And you can pick that up from the connections between the different maps.
Yeah,
Right.
Simon, if I can jump in there from an enterprise architecture
Well,
business
everyone's going to miss that AI and sovereignty.
point of view,
I'll give you
yeah,
the hard question, hard one.
from an AI from a business architecture, enterprise architecture point of view,
Yep.
what Dante is referring to is the need for abstraction, because what you look at is the various components, the various elements that you have, and then you
Yeah.
abstract them up to say, what do they do for me? And
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
when you find that they're in a common category, and
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
category is part of a taxonomy, and that's how you organize things so that you
Fantastic.
can identify them. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay, let's move on.
maps help with that. So let me move on then.
Yeah.
Well, Dante, I found the maps help with that, and duplication is just one of the various problems that we face. I mean, misapplication of methods, misuse of contracts. I mean, there's just a long list. Somebody once said to me that it was through a recent study, about 80% of IT projects fail. And what amazes me about that is that 20% succeed. I think that must be a heroic effort to make the 20% succeed, because we seem to make choices and decisions without understanding the user's needs, components, without applying the right methods. We often have poor contract structures. I mean, everything is stacked against projects actually being successful, as far as I can tell. So I'm not shocked that 80% failed. I'm amazed 20% succeed. I think that must require enormous efforts. Okay, AI. Roughly 2016, this is where I left it with serverless. Runtime becomes a utility, new practice. I'm going to ignore most of this map, which I often do, and then just expand the bits I'm interested in. So I'm going to go user application, coding environment. We had practice, FinOps, and serverless. So back in 2018. Now, at that time, we were talking a lot about, we called it more machine cognition. AI is a big field covering many, many different things. I'm not of which, for example, large language models are just one component. When we were looking at this, we talked about it more in terms of machine cognition in reference to human cognition and a subset of that. And we were looking about how it was evolving. And we thought, well, it's going to eventually become more of a utility. We don't exactly know what the right model is. And we were interested in what the impacts of that would be. Well, we knew we'd get new practices appearing, but what could those practices be? And one of the interesting ones was to combine it with the you're going to get new things, but combine it with the development environments themselves. And so this led to an idea of conversational programming environments. This was back in 2018. So very simply, we could see from the maps and the discussions that we had, we were going to head into a world where, well, it was the world of Jonna Freeman and Nicholas Negroponte. So back in the 70s odd, Nicholas Negroponte wrote a paper, Architecture by Yourself, and it's based upon the ideas of Jonna Freeman, who was a designer, architect, I should say. And Jonna Freeman described the process of design as being a conversation between the minds of two or more designers. And sometimes, those perspectives, I should say, were actually in the mind of one designer. So what's going to change is one of those designers was going to be the machine. And this is what we mean by conversational programming. You're going to have a conversation to build something. And a friend of mine who came along to these mapping sessions and these talks decided to go and build it and presented it at AWS reInvent in 2018. So this is Alexander Simovich. He presented a system which you had a conversation with. In his case, he went beyond just text. It was actually a verbal conversation. So you talked to the machine. It was all built with AI systems underneath it, and it would build another machine for you, as in another service. So there's a wonderful video of him saying, I want to measure, I want a customer database. I think was the one, which is publicly quite well known. And it would ask him lots of questions about how it wanted to be, and it would create this whole thing for him. Very, very simple. Okay, so back in 2018, that's where you would invest. We roll forward to 2023, and we get things like large language models. We get Copilots, prompt engineering, job. So chat-orientated programming, which is just conversational programming. So it's exactly the same thing. That's all happening. So what's interesting about that? Well, my interesting is this difference here between coding environments and co-pilots. Because in our typical of coding environment, you think something like Visual Studio, it's a human interacting with a system through a much more linear path to some extent, a defined set of operations, whereas a co-pilot is often more of a conversation that's going on. So there's a change in tools happening. And those tools require language, and our language in coding environments tends to be declarative, but this was more prompts. Prompts are Turing complete if they have memory. And you've also underneath this got a medium. So that medium is in the world of the traditional world is code as text. But in our new world, those code, particularly with large multimodal models, could be images. That could be the seed for creating whatever it is you wish to build. So tools, language, and medium are changing. Medium is the way we convey symbolic instructions. All right, so there's something I want to particularly point out with text and images. This is a group of city planners from all over the world. We came together back in 2022, 2021, mapped out coherent city transport. So this is one of the maps that we created, and this is the image on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side is the text, the code that created the image. Now, when we talked about the image, we were talking about relationships between objects and the context they exist within. But when we're talking about code, it's often rules, syntax, and style. So the nature of the conversation actually changed. And you see this with engineering teams with there's the one conversation on a screen and one conversation which is on the whiteboard, which is about the same problem, but it's a very different conversation. Now, what happened here is we realized through these conversations that the internet was a transport system. And it impacts every other transport system. And that matters because we built all these wonderful digital twins of cities at vast expense, and none of them use the internet as a transport system. So that's like building a digital twin and forgetting there are roads. I mean, that would be quite a mistake. But more interestingly for me was this concept of tools, language, and medium, because those are the ways we reason around the world around us. So to make this a bit more real for you, if you think back, if you take the tool as the printing press, the medium as the paper, and the language as the written word, if you imagine a group of people controlled that, you find a group you don't like in history and just pretend they control the printing press, the paper, and the written word. They control how you reason and future generations reason. That's a pretty powerful thing to have. I mean, you could be Darwin coming along saying, I think we should have evolutionary theory, and they go, well, you say you want to publish a paper, not without printing presses. I'm going to write a paper on this, not without paper. I'm going to write it down then, not without words. You can't have that word. I mean, this is terribly powerful levels of control. And unfortunately, your choices are you're either going to use guardrails and trust in particular bodies to look after this, in which case you create a new theocracy and they will control how you reason, or you go for an open approach, which basically means you force an industry to be more open. And with OpenAI, we're not just talking about the code, we're talking about all the symbolic instructions, which means the models, the architecture, all the way down to the training data. Of course, the lobbyists are out there telling you, danger, danger, frontier AI. I would say the things you should be much more concerned about is actually the formation of new theocracies. So that's the choice that you have. And that leads me into a conversation of sovereignty. So AI, in terms of Is it useful in different places? Yes. There are many use cases where machine cognition is actually extremely useful. I mean, you have to obviously be concerned about hallucinations. You've obviously got to be concerned about biases. These systems have a very, very strong bias towards a market focus over a societal focus, by the way, mostly because they're trained on market data, or we believe they are. We don't know because the training data is not actually open. And that's actually what really, really makes them dangerous. And this has sovereignty implications. So when we talk about sovereignty, we normally do so with the aid of a map. So we talk about territorial sovereignty. Here is our map. This is our border. Here's our society. If you cross our border, we'll conflict with you. Will generally try and collaborate and cooperate with you outside it. We may cooperate to conflict with others, whatever. Okay, but we normally define it in terms of here's our border. All right. So the territorial is only one of 5 landscapes we compete in. So this is a piece of work at the DVLA back in 2015. We took the automotive industry and we rolled it forward to 2025. We basically said, cars are going to become more commodity-like. We're going to see much more intelligent agents, much more sensors, blah, blah, blah. And we're going to get some other things. We're going to get a digital subscription model. Someone will invent one of those. And sure enough, I think it was BMW started, or Tesla in a way do as well. So you get digital subscription models for things within the design. I think BMW's one you have to pay to have a heated seat or something. Can't quite remember. But the big one we were concerned about was route management. So somebody would have a subscription service based around route management. Why is that a problem? Because it embeds social inequality into transportation systems. So if you imagine people are driving along the road or self-driving cars going along the road, a gold member comes along, all the bronze members get out of the way. Yay, isn't that great? Except for if we have a flood, it means all the poor people die because all the rich people get out, but all the poor people's cars, being a lower membership status, either don't turn up because they're picking up rich people, or anyway, net effect is next day you have pitchforks and revolution and the rest of it, because there are important values in society and you can't just focus on exclusion. But so that was our concern. We were also looking at how China was playing the game. Its focus on strategic investment, very, very smart. And we also realized that, users are a member of society. Society has values. Those values are embedded in the simulation models. What do we mean by that? It's the trolley problem. Cars coming along, kill one person, or 5 people do you kill? Well, you kill the one person. What if the one person is a double platinum member and the 5 people are bronze members or whatever? Well, hopefully you still kill the one person, but not all societies treat everybody equally. So that then creates a problem. And that problem is, the values being trained into these things, assuming the training data is open, well, that's one of your borders that you want to protect. And the other areas are where you might want to cooperate and collaborate. So this was an example done back in 2015 about the map going forward into the future, the importance of values in these training data, and also the use of this to identify where to defend yourself and where we were going to have to, where we could cooperate and collaborate. So that's an example of sovereignty on a map. And this is back in 2015. Most organizations, most governments have no understanding of their technological economic landscape to the level of a map. Certainly very, very difficult for them to identify where to protect and not. Most of them are reduced to story-based forms like we should protect data or something. Well, there's some data you should protect, not necessarily all. Again, you really need to think about the landscape itself. So the question you should always ask is, where are the maps, radars, and situation rooms for the technological, social, and economic landscapes? The answer is you don't have them, but there we are. So that gets us sovereignty. I'm going to say, we're 1 minute over. I hope that was
Okay.
interesting.
Thank you, Simon. I think again, great add-on, extra value, the AI and the sovereignty stuff and lessons from that. So again, thanks very
Oh,
much.
it's
I think
my
it's been an
pleasure.
excellent session. I'm sure there's more than enough interest amongst the community to invite you back again. Um, I'm going to wrap up quite quickly since we are a little over time. Just to say, please stay in touch. There are quite a number of people who did join the session who did not register formally. You must have got links from colleagues or somewhere. Please just send us your email address so that we can keep in touch in future and so that we can share the recording. Um, Other than that, we are planning some more upcoming sessions. We're likely to be doing one on systems thinking in business engineering or business architecture. It has some very interesting insights of how that can shape what we include, don't include in models, what is relevant, what has high levels of influence or doesn't, and how we can incorporate that into our thinking. Also, probably an update on AI. Now, many of you know we also collaborate with another company which is run by Jay van Sale and his colleagues in the AI space, and we may well invite Jay back again and possibly Jay and Simon together. That would be a very exciting session. So we'll see what we can put together. Um, Otherwise, yeah, I think we can wrap it up for the day. Thank you all for attending. And Simon, especially, once again, thanks very much for sharing and great session and what you share with the world. For those who want more on Simon, you will find a lot of stuff on the web if you just search under his name or Wardley Mapping. There's also a book, Simon. I think that's available at, is it swordley.com or something like that?
Oh, my
Me-
medium.com/Wardley Maps.
Okay, there you go.
But however, it's all Creative Commons. Other people have taken that, turned it into physical book because they say, "Can I publish this book?" Yeah, of course you can. Just tidy it up, and people do. And
Yeah.
there's sites like there's Learn Wardley Maps, there's wardleymaps.com. There's all these. And Wardley Maps is run by
In
Christoph
in
Daniels. Loads of people involved.
yeah, in that vein, at Inspired, we are in the process of incorporating the Wardley mapping ideas into the stuff we do. So it'll also be appearing in our literature and training. Um, and we may well offer some training around the concept in future. So keep your eyes open for that. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Please pop your thanks in the chat and we'll share those with Simon as well. Okay,
Thank you.
call it a day. Thank you very much, guys. Take care.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks.